Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Isolation Break, an Asia Pacific Writers and Translators in New York Writers Workshop co-production. I'm Ravi Shankar, and little did we realize that when we began this series in March that here we would be in November and we would still be going, but that is the case, and really overjoyed to have another terrific lineup of writers that we're going to hear from today. And very briefly, for those of you that are just coming in, Isolation Break is a co-production of the two organizations I mentioned, APWT and YWW. And I wanted to just mention that APWT has a new book that has just come out. The official launch will be in December, Meridian, which is a collaboration between Drunken Boat and the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, the first APWT publication. And it's a very handsome book indeed. So I'll mention something about that as we get going. And before we meet the readers for today and say both good evening and good morning to our readers who are in Asia and Australia, I just wanted to turn this over to Tim Tomlinson, who's the executive director of the New York Writers Workshop. It has been, I think, a very fruitful collaboration between the two organizations, and I'm hoping you might just say a few words about what WYY is up to now and in the forthcoming year.
Thank you, Ravi. Tim Tomlinson here, coming out of Brooklyn, straight out of Brooklyn. So happy to be here with this crew and to be participating in the collaboration with Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. New York Writers Workshop has done a lot of work with APWT. And this, I think, is probably its flagship collaboration. New York Writers Workshop is, like I think almost every other not-for-profit, undergoing some significant changes with the pandemic. One of the things we've been doing a lot of work on is work online. And we have, I think, several new board members that we're going to announce very soon, as soon as our new website is up to ready for prime time, and it almost is. One of the things we'll be doing in the new year is a series of workshops under the title of the Zoomable MFA. New York Writers Workshop is the organization that put together the portable MFA, and the Zoomable MFA will even be lighter in your pocket. So we'll keep you posted, and we'll let you know when the website's up. We hope to see you visit. Hope to see you in sessions. I'll turn it back over to Ravi.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And we have a wonderful roster, as I mentioned, of writers, including Tim Tomlinson, Paul Corrigan, Varsha Saraiya-Shah, Kirun Kapur, and Kawika Guillermo. And so we'll hear from each of them. And then at the end, we'll have a question and answers. I completely encourage you to ask any questions. There is a chat that we can see. So if you have any questions or thoughts, oh, I'm seeing Paul a second time. Okay. Well, Paul has his doppelganger. Oh, there we go. I think I'll remove. Oh, there, perfect. So let us get started then. And in fact, that's a perfect timing because our first writer for today, in fact, is Paul Corrigan. And let me introduce you to him. Okay. So Paul teaches creative and academic writing at the University of Tampa. His poems have appeared in the St. Catherine Review, Poets Reading the News, and the Ekphrastic Review. And he's twice won the Rattle Ekphrastic Challenge. And he's interviewed a number of poets. In fact, I've been interviewed by him, Leung Lee, Naomi Shihab Nye, David Mura, Emily Jingmin Yoon, and many others. And he has his own blog, which I really recommend, the Corrigan Literary Review. And he's also published essays on teaching and learning in such venues as Profession, Pedagogy, and theatlantic.com. So welcome, Paul. It's so great to have you. And you're coming to us from Florida?
Florida, yes. Thanks. So glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Well, I'm going to get us started with 3 sea poems to honor the oceans between us, the waters between us. The first are playful, serious, and I think then the third is a kind of a little more serious. All 3 are ekphrastic poems responding to other works of art. So the first is Father Taylor's Sermon, which is a too long didn't read version of Moby Dick. Ahab runs loose. The pirates chase Ahab. The gods chase Ahab. The whale chases Ahab. Ahab chases Ahab. But I say unto you, yea, yea, the rope. Beware, flying specter of the sea, the rope chases Ahab, while Ahab runs loose, loose. The second is a poem responding to Gabrielle Wu Lee's Iceland Revelation, Snowstorm on Blue Lagoon. And you really, to appreciate this painting, you have to be in its presence. It is massive, and it is dramatic, and it is like a stormy sea about to happen. And so this poem responds to that. When blue skies and blue seas begin to foment and froth, turn red and white, the apocalypse is surely nigh. Or perhaps a tremendous tempest, or at least a spectacular sunset. Whichever the case, be afraid. So afraid you cannot move, so afraid you cannot stay still, so afraid you understand why awful means full of awe. Of course, your boat will hold against the ice. You will not drown, freeze, or be lit by lightning. It is because you will live that you must fear. So row into the apocalypse, row into the tremendous tempest, row into the spectacular sunset, muscles throbbing, boards creaking, waves towering, each pull of oar, sheer stillness, each pause between pulls, sheer movement. So it will come to pass that a seagull will cry out from the last pale corner of open sky. Then you will hear the whale song and the plankton song. Then the squid and the krill will lift their voices, and you will join them in that singing. All the waters and all that is in the waters, without a sound, with every sound, singing that one true and final chanty of the sea. And then my third and last poem is in response to The Coast of Genoa by Jasper Francis Cropsey. I saw this one as well in person in the museum. And it is large and spectacular and gorgeous and scenic. And it is this lighthouse on this coast with mountains. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to find out, is this an actual lighthouse or the imagination of the painter? And I eventually did locate it in Genoa on the coast. I went and visited by Google Maps, and I learned about the history of the city and the history of the lighthouse. And it was just kind of heartbreaking to know the ships and the violence that the ships that sailed from and to this lighthouse had in history. And so there was this scenic painting, beautiful, gorgeous, romantic painting with clouds and waves so vivid it could break your heart. And then there's the history that would actually break your heart. And I just felt the juxtaposition of that. And so here is my poem. Oldest of the tall lighthouses, tallest of the old ones, O Lanterna, call home your ships. Do not let them sail for the Indies. Leave the Americas alone. Keep them out of the Caribbean. Let Africa be. Call Columbus back with empty hands. Call your slave vessels back with empty hulls. Attend to your own wounds. Your crumbling architecture testifies of centuries of sacking and being sacked, of cannon fire and cannon fodder, of the banners of 1/10 of Europe, of wars with Venice and Milan. Attend also to your own joys. Scale your peaks with boulders, waterfalls, mosses, trees. Watch your birds skittering and swooping along your churning coast. Spend more time with your barrels of good wine, your wheels of good cheese. Put to better use the skills and sextants of your honored sailors and shipwrights. Dredge what's buried beneath your morning and evening tides. Rebuild your ruins, your piles of iron and stone. Call home your ships with your shining. Shine, shine, shine. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Paul. Very powerful reading, and I'm hoping in our conversation that we can talk a little bit about ekphrasis and your process. So thank you so much for that reading. That was great. And welcome those of you that are just joining us. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is Isolation Break, the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop co-production. This is our final reading of the season. We will hopefully get going again next year, unless we're able to congregate in public, in which case we can have live readings again. But the great beauty of this is that we're getting to hear from people from around the globe. And I'm particularly thrilled to introduce our next guest. Varsha Saraiya-Shah is coming to us from Houston, and Varsha and I know each other for a long time. We're both part of a wonderful South Asian collective called Matwala, and Usha Kela, who is one of the founders, read for the series, and Pramila Venkateswaran, who is another founder, hopefully will read in the forthcoming year. So it's wonderful to have Varsha with us. She's an American of Indian origin. Her poetry collection Voices was published by Finishing Line, and her work has appeared in many anthologies and journals, including Asian Shah, Borderlands, Convergence, Dos Gatos Press, Eco Poetry from the Texas Gulf Coast, the Penguin Global Anthology of Poetry Under Lockdown, and a photography book as well. And she's a member of Matwala, the South Asian Diaspora Collective, and she's been featured on local public radio and been staged in a multi-language sensory dance program, Poetry in Motion, in Houston, Texas. And she also is bilingual and continues to write in her mother tongue of Gujarati. So nice to have you, Varsha. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Ravi, thank you. It's an honor to be invited and reading to be with this esteemed lineup of poets. The first poem, I'm going to read one poem which is kind of like brings in levity in this time of social distancing and technology. I think it's more for the isolation break, the theme. It's a relatively new poem, and then it'll be followed by 3 short poems. This one's titled Night of Monsters, Mad Scientists, and Blue Moon on Driveway Cinema. Wi-Fi is a cranky creature tonight. We high-five with flying kisses, a protocol at Cassandra's Driveway Hitchcock Cinema. Social distanced, we smell Pablo's popcorn, hear Katie's crunching pita chips. Dark, fractured by a full and blue moon, no one but I identify as Sharad Poonam. The Harvest Fest night, missing my rice pudding laced with saffron and cardamom, paired with spicy bhajis, I pine for Gujarati folk dancing. Strangely, it's Halloween Eve. Cupcake loose, she rubs her tail on my shin, gazing through her bright blue marbles. I offer her mulled wine from my mug, she paws away. I savor the first warm sip in autumn chill, sweet bitter like the dark, cursed with unstable cable. Its weak signal, its sad high-five pun for Wi-Fi. Cassandra reboots YouTube, our Saturday pandemic hangout. Some can't distance the way you picture the ideal in your head. No escaping destiny, the young Frankenstein swears. I emigrated the year this classic emerged. I felt like a traitor to friends left behind. Tonight, I'm the only one watching this thriller first time, yet with friends understanding. How could one arrive without leaving? Yet, as Mary Oliver said, it took me years to understand that this too was a gift. The impassioned hand of time hastens us all. We are in the dark, wooed by the wool of moonlight, TV, the blue moon. Shannon spills the pot of hot mulled wine, goes on cheering as if she is Elizabeth in her ecstasy with the monster. Ah, sweet mystery of life. Heedless, what a mess she has made. Cassandra, clueless in her chair, 6 feet away, nudges Julio, her hubby, half asleep, mullwined. Squeezing her yellow-eyed fudgy, purring, no worries, no worries. We'll make someone clean it up, as if. Ah, dulce misterio de la vida. Inga sings ecstatic. We are a chorus with its own harmony. Wi-Fi drizzles rain like. Time for intermission. Julio rises, takes orders for tea, chocolate, or vanilla ice cream. Popcorn's pale stars all over. Mooney wine puddle glistens. And here's my next one. This one is on numbers. I'm a number person, so I thought that let me bring one. And my father and I, we both were number people, so it's a kind of like a tribute to him also. In praise of how we count. My hand holds 14 counts, Asha tells Emily, her American friend, who says, no, a hand is a count of 5. Asha flips her hand open like a folded fan. Look, each finger with 3 sections totals 12. The short thumb is worth 2. That's how I learned arithmetic. Papa used to say, our fingers are not equal, but vital together, unique like people. And remember, like a family, no matter how different each member, their blood connects them. Ha! A family that fits in my fist, Asha had snorted with laughter. Is it my shelter or bondage? Amma explained, neither. Your fist is a nest of magic. You and your fate. A palm etched forever with grid lines, the map of your destiny, only yours to explore. It knows the invisible, with a door into sacred. Asha waves her hand to Emily, kite-like, talking to other birds. She fancies being wind, the kind that needs no accounting. Come dark, Asha flaps her fist onto pillow. Hello, give me 5. And imagines her fingers bursting with countless stars, her team of dreams. They follow her kite as if a comet's tail deep into sleep. Each night, she catches a star like no one else's. And the next one is kind of an ekphrastic poem. It is an ekphrastic. So in following Paul's footsteps, so I decided to read this one. And it's titled Promise to Last. Forever, the booklets of postal stamps lay in my dresser, ever ready to perform. They are the albums of jazz masters, actors, inventors from 1920s, 30s, 40s. They remind me to use them before I die or lose my desire to share their beauty and sparkle, their promise to last forever. Some cost only 22 cents. With a similar promise, a paring knife in the kitchen performs, forever sharp, trademark, embossed on his body. It is a kind of knife we give each other, unsure when and who will surrender to loss or cut through the decline of knowing. A promise similar to an intense passion for the baubles I collected once in discarded matchboxes as a child, blue, green, gold marbles, crystal beads, and broken bottle glass. My small world held awe for the rainbows they made, how animated every viewing of a handmade kaleidoscope became. Boxes and the scope became bookends for my tiny store of needle-sewn myths, each fostering an undying desire to remain magical, magical forever. And I'll finish with a short poem it was inspired by a poem by Hermann Hesse. It was a poem called Two Children at the end of 1914. So it's about Spanish flu, and I thought it was appropriate for this pandemic break. This poem was translated by James Wright. So the title of my poem is a line from Hermann Hesse's poem. Title is, "And If My Wish for You Has Any Power." You, newborn and to the womb bound, you know nothing of spring 2020, but for its memory, your parents will carry, pass on. A viral microbe rampant, killing with its invisible touch. You at your mother's breast, or striving to arrive into gentle but alert hands. Eyes around you must seem alien, eyes doting with bodies hovering in plastic armors and shields. Yet, touch is the best human song you'll first arise with, to hold you, or soon will. Nevertheless, you will grow and know of the dreams with the dreary of your touched life. You will learn of the farmer and his seasonal prowess, your own unyielding will and mouths of desire, eager hands gifting like the doctor and her promised delivery. You will endure many more struggles for those yet to conceive their sweet breaths, to know such touch is only a loan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Varsha. Oh, I'm lingering with that feeling of touch. Thank you for that. And we'll have a discussion at the end of this. Thank you for those of you who are just joining us. I'm Ravi Shankar. Again, this is Isolation Break, a New York Writers Workshop and Asia Pacific Writers and Translators collaboration. And we're not just poets. There are also fiction writers and nonfiction writers. And we're going to hear from a prose writer next, which is very exciting. But I just wanted to share with you this Meridian, the Asia Pacific Writer and Translators first book, which is going to be launched in a couple of weeks now. And here's a little blurb from Pulitzer Prize winner Vijay Seshadri on the anthology. What the Meridian anthology aspires to is nothing less than making an area of the globe a unity by establishing it another republic of letters, a huge, various, enormously vibrant area bound together by English as the lingua franca, an area exploding with young energy where the need for self-knowledge that literature can supply is exigent and extreme. The book they've made is new and fresh and thrilling, suffused with the sense of a beginning, but also with the sense of the perennial and the permanent. So Meridian will be out soon. And if you're interested, Isolation Break and many of the opportunities here are open to all the members of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators. You can Google apwriters.org to see how to become a member. And I'm very excited now to introduce our next reader, Kawika Guillermo, who's a writer and editor and scholar. He's currently living in Vancouver, Canada, and his debut novel, which has just come out, stamped an anti-travel novel. I'm very interested to talk to Kawika about this idea of the anti-travel novel. It won the 2020 Association for Asian American Studies Creative Writing Prose Book Award. And the second novel, All Flowers Bloom, is a queer, speculative revision of histories and imagined futures. His short stories can be found at the Cimarron Review, the Hawaii Pacific Review, and Decomp Journal, which he serves as managing editor. And he's also an assistant professor in the Social Justice Institution at the University of British Columbia and the author of the nonfiction books Transitive Cultures, Anglophone Literature of the Trans-Pacific, and Open World Empire, Race, Erotics, and the Global Rise of Video Games, which also just came out with NYU Press this year. So pretty productive year, Kawika. Welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so good to be here. I'm so happy to be here. I've been wanting to go, and I've been following these isolation breaks. And so thank you very much for having them. They have been very rejuvenating since all of this has been happening. I should acknowledge that I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people, as well as acknowledging the invisible labor, past and present, that has allowed me to be here. And I also want to plug my books that Ravi also just mentioned. This is All Flowers Bloom, which came out in March, and then Open World Empire, which came out, I don't know if you'd see it, in April. Both very, very different. So one for each mood of the day. Again, thanks to Ravi, because part of what I've been really struggling with lately is just how to write or what to write. As all of this is going on, and wanting to write things that are engaging and responsive, but also then there's just so much to respond to that I find it very overwhelming. And so I wanted to share some very new work that basically only was made possible because of all of the things that have been going on in 2020. And I had no time on my hands, so I would have like an hour where I would go to a cafe or just to a park and try and write. And I wasn't able to for quite a while, and so I just started coming up with this mantra, which was, I can't write for shit right now, but anyways, and then trying to write something. So admitting that my writing is just horrible right now, but then trying to do something anyways. So this is what came out of that. I don't know what it's called. It's kind of creative nonfiction, kind of the byline I have is that it's fake punk, self-hurt, anti-memoir, which I don't know what that is, but it seems to typify what I'm doing a bit. It's partly about moving from Hong Kong to Vancouver after I never thought I would be moving back to North America. I'm American myself, but I really left thinking I would never be back, especially in a work position. It's also partly about becoming a father and partly about my own father. So this is a larger project, and part of it is supposed to be published in the Journal of Asian American Studies next year. But I'll read a short excerpt, and this excerpt is called A-Hole. And it begins with an epigram. What I write and how I write is done in order to save my own life. Barbara Christian, 1987. When my family moves from Hong Kong to Vancouver in 2018, I'm the American yokel, the arrogant, overpublished chauvinist who stands tall while the smoke clears around him. A year later, and I'm counting numbers with my son, when I'm struck by a headline on Facebook. The Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, in an Aladdin costume with full body paint, his arms over two beautiful white women, as if pretending to abduct them. The headline says he wore brownface at a 2001 gala when he was a teacher at the West Point Grey Academy in Vancouver. I look up the school. It's 2 miles from our apartment. Over the next week, I learn a lot about my colleagues in my new city. People are disappointed but not angry. They are worried about how this will all go down on the news, but they don't ask me, as the father in a brown family, how it is going down for me. Few people think that one incident in brownface, which escalates to 2 more in blackface, is a reason to withhold a vote. Few people think that October 2001, 1 month after 9/11, when violence against Muslims and anyone Muslim-looking had skyrocketed 1,700%, and the US was bombing the Middle East to hell, was a bad time for the son of Canada's most famous prime minister to walk the streets of a multicultural city in a costume that said, "Your lives are worthless, your humanity is a joke." Remember Canada, your prime minister was once the moment in the movement of black-faced photographs. Too brown to frown, just wait till they get you in an Arabian gown. Fume in anger, reluctant to call them out for their casual racism. It's hard to be the fly in the ointment when you need that ointment to treat a diaper rash. In time, turn from anger to fear. This is the city my son will grow up in, with these fuckers. A land where people will hug you just to avoid looking you in the eye. I once saw myself in Aladdin, even though I couldn't pronounce his name, even though he was a different kind of brown, even though his face was modeled off of Tom Cruise. Quick, cunning, nippleless chest, Aladdin taught me that when they say Asian people complimentarily, they don't mean me. When they say white people disparagingly, they do mean me. When they say us, they mean me, only insofar as I pass their tests. When they say them, that is one of their tests. Remember this, my dear innocent Philam me. Feminists will still give their children the surname of their white fathers, and the anti-racists are just moments away from exposing their brown-faced photographs. From where, my son will ask, does our brownness come? And I will declare, a hole. One day, my wife and I invite a colleague's family to our house. While playing with our son, their 4-year-old daughter says casually, brown is disgusting. Not brown like chocolate, but brown like skin. Disgusting. The parents' faces are red with embarrassment. My wife and I try to laugh it off. We ask, as if to puncture the wound again, our baby is brown. What do you think of? Do you think he is disgusting? We do not know it, but we are testing them, the parents as well as the child. The girl gazes at our son. We are ready with our instant, intuitive sneers. Here's the thing about being mixed, brown, Asian, queer, and all sorts of fucked up. As a child, everyone will call you beautiful, even if you're fat. As a teenager, no one will acknowledge you exist, so you'll spend most of your time playing Counter-Strike and throwing donuts at passing police cars. You ain't white, but you also ain't Mexican, brown, or indigenous. As a Filipino, you'll have a 90% chance of living your life plagued by the question, what is a Filipino? You'll be an alloy with few allies, compound in a world of natural elements. You might convince yourself that everyone is wearing a face, holding their breath, waiting for you to rust. Call myself Hapa, I'm stealing from Kanaka Maoli. Call myself mixed, I'm really white. Call myself Halfi, I'm playing a game. Call myself Halfu, I'm just not getting it. Call myself mongrel, I'm deranged. Call myself a mutt, nowhere is my home. Ain't anyone in the city ever seen brown trash before? The kind that streaks across paper, and it could be a turd or could be leftover chocolate. In the galaxy of diversity, we are but planets, some larger than others, some in strange ellipticals, some with icy crowns, some closer to the center, some so far and so small they are no longer called planets. Planets have their own gravities. They have their own Romanized mythological names, their own astrological charts, and all circle the sun. Gravitas, depth, where creation comes. The Tom Cruise and Tom Hanks and all the Toms who wear Arabian gowns. And my father, Howley a-hole, toes my anger. How could I stop seeing him? How can a planet stop circling the sun without getting sucked up? For we, the planets of diversity and the elliptical draws our gravity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kawika. That was great. And we'll look forward to hearing more from Kawika and all the others at the end of this reading. Those of you that are just joining us, again, I'm Ravi Shankar. This is Isolation Break, the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators in New York Writers Workshop collaboration. And I loved how Kawika introduced his reading. I should mention I'm on the ground of the Wampanoag, and it is really sad that all of the indigenous tribes that lived here in Rhode Island and elsewhere across the country are memorialized in the names of places and erased in many ways from the landscape. And so that was a good reminder of that. All right, so we're halfway through, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce a good friend and, in fact, the director of the New York Writers Workshop, Tim Tomlinson. And Tim Tomlinson, in addition to helping run the New York Writers Workshop, is also the author of Requiem for the Tree Fort I Set on Fire, which is poetry, and This Is Not Happening to You, which is short fiction. His chapbook, Yolanda, Oral History in Verse, chronicles the impact of climate change catastrophe, Super Typhoon Haiyan, in the Philippines. He's also the co-author of the craft book that Tim was talking about at the beginning of our session, the Portable MFA in Creative Writing, which is available and in use on 4 continents. Keep your eyes open next year for the Zoomable MFA. It's on its way. And recent work of his appears in a number of places, including the Columbia Journal, About Place, the Good Life Review, Passenger's Journal, and Text. And he's also, as we mentioned, co-founder, director of the New York Writers Workshop, and he's a professor at NYU's Global Liberal Studies department. And you can always find out more about his work at timtomlinson.org. So welcome, Tim. It's so great to have you for Isolation Break.
It's great to be here. Great to be part of this series, and great to be part of this this panel. The work has been phenomenal. I've been blown away right from the beginning. I want to read something new, material that I've been working on since the beginning of the pandemic. I put projects aside, and new things started to emerge as I've been teaching a course in the fragmented narrative. And what I'm going to read is fragmented narrative. This is called Parentheticals. It's a triptych of flash fictions. Number 1, the book I read. I lived in the apartment below the philosophy professor and his wife, the painter. He had written several famous books she exhibited in respected galleries. I imagined their apartment to be wall-to-wall books interspersed with original paintings. It was the kind of apartment I imagined I'd inhabit someday, even if that day seemed very far off and I had no idea how I'd get there. From an earlier marriage, the philosophy professor had a daughter. She had short hair and short skirts and looked like Jean Seberg in Breathless. Sometimes she and the philosophy professor walked arm in arm up the hill toward Broadway, pressing books against their chests as they leaned into the wind. They'd laugh at how hard the wind made it to climb the hill. I thought, I'd like to have a daughter like that, someone I could laugh with at the silly things. And I thought I'd like to have a father like the philosophy professor, someone with big ideas, but who could still find pleasure in everyday challenges. At the university, I'd seen men's room graffiti about the philosophy professor and his daughter, what they did with each other. It struck me as crude and unfair. One day, the daughter knocked at my door. I was playing the Talking Heads song, the book I read, and she wanted to talk about this song. So did I. We had a long, substantive discussion from afternoon to early evening. We touched on many significant points. I suggested how good it would be if her father, the philosopher, were with us. He'd have interesting philosophies to share. I mentioned the crude graffiti I'd seen in the university's men's room, how unfair I thought it was. She shrugged. They had seen it too. It didn't bother them, she said. She pointed to my t-shirt. It showed a picture of my favorite Rolling Stone, Brian Jones, deceased, sneering at the camera. You want to trade, she said, holding out the hem of her t-shirt. Hers was the Mapplethorpe portrait of Patti Smith that appears on the cover of Horses. I liked it well enough, not as much as my Brian Jones, but I said, okay. What she did then, well, I still think about it. Without hesitation, she pulled the t-shirt right over her head. She wore nothing underneath. She was petite, small breasts, but not boyish. There was no mistaking what she was. That happened in my kitchen. It had grown pretty dark and I hadn't turned on any lights. Still, I lived on the ground floor. What would someone walking up the hill think, I wondered, if they looked in? I thought they'd think, how could that clown get so lucky? I hope they did look in and think that. She didn't seem to be thinking anything. She handed me her t-shirt the way you'd hand a cashier a book. I handed her mine. Then she went back upstairs. For the next hour or so, I heard her walking around up there. I stared at the ceiling, trying to picture where she was, the books around her, the paintings. I saw her a couple more times after that, walking with her father up the windy hill, always carrying books. Later, she moved to Berlin and published her own book, a memoir about growing up in New York City with a philosopher father. For her author photo, she posed in front of graffiti on the Berlin Wall. The graffiti struck me as crude, but I couldn't read it. I had the impression that she could. Below an unbuttoned blazer, she wore my Brian Jones t-shirt. That was my brush with immortality. 2. A psychiatrist in Lower Manhattan. I knew a psychiatrist who lived in Lower Manhattan. His office was in his home, and his home had no windows. It was in one of those vast, characterless buildings whose base seemed as wide and as square as the 4 blocks that enclosed it. Its interior apartments were vast as well, but all that space came with the drawback of no natural light. Across from the building, past a narrow sliver of park lined by benches facing the avenues, was J&R Music World. If his apartment had windows, the psychiatrist said, he could raise one and hit J&R with a paper plane. It was that close. He walked over there nearly every day. He visited the formidable classical music section, and on most days he walked off with several new purchases. He loved opera, early music, classical contemporary, all of it. The clerks easily convinced him that there were recordings he absolutely needed to own. On nice days, he'd take his purchases to one of the benches in that narrow sliver of park, slip the cellophane off the discs or box, and study the liner notes, or any inner matter provided. He especially liked to study the opera boxes, which often came with libretto printed in 3 or more languages. The psychiatrist spoke Italian and German, some French, a little Russian. He liked to see how closely the record company translations matched the ones he might have done had he been the translator. The psychiatrist shared his windowless home with his wife, a visual artist, and 2 children. The wife made installations. She might pile something in the corner of a gallery floor, laundry or garbage, which she called found objects, and that would be the installation. She made other objects too, things out of clay or yarn or canvas, which she nailed to plywood boards and hung around the windowless rooms. None were aesthetically pleasing, at least not in the sense of beauty. They might have been aesthetically pleasing in the sense of idea. One of the rooms in the windowless apartment was her studio. It resembled the room of a child who never picks up after herself. She said that she would have been a painter if her studio had windows, but without windows, there is no light, at least no light worth painting. And if nothing else, she said, painting was about light. So was psychoanalysis, her husband said, but she disagreed. She said it must be about something else, because her husband practiced excellent psychoanalysis, but in a room utterly devoid of light. The psychiatrist had a den, also lightless, in which he kept a stereo system made of state-of-the-art components from Germany and Austria and Japan. The speakers were the size of refrigerators. His amplifier and preamp powered them to the extent that he was certain they could be heard all the way down in Coney Island, where he was born and from which he escaped. Once he played Maria Callas singing Costa Diva for me. It made my jacket appear as if I was walking into a strong wind. The cilia in my ears remained down for days. In rock, he conjectured, only The Who could have played louder. I often wondered about the effect of living with no windows. Actually, I didn't wonder. I felt quite certain that the effect would be negative. It certainly was, I believed, for the psychiatrist's children, a boy, 3, who was allergic to everything including his mother's milk, and a girl, 6, who might come home from the park with a rock and hand it to you saying, "Here, I brought you this rock from the park," to which you might say, "Oh, gee, well, thank you," and put it in your pocket, since there were no windows through which you might throw it away. 3. Winona Ryder. There are women in New York City who look just like the women you see in movies. Beautiful, ethereal, sultry, soulful. I see them through the windows of my bus. They're talking on phones or pulling carry-on luggage from a handle or looking down the avenue for the Uber that's coming to cart them away. I see them and understand why people want to live in New York City, the men at least. They come for all the beautiful women who look like the beautiful women they've fallen in love with in movies. Some of them, no doubt, are the beautiful women they've fallen in love with in movies. Once at a yoga studio in Lower Manhattan, I changed from street clothes to yoga shorts in the same changing room as Gwyneth Paltrow. This was before Paltrow won the Academy Award, before Goop, before she became the insulated bubble-dwelling dope everyone loves to hate with a kid she named Apple. So being in that room with her, watching while trying not to watch, the utterly casual way she peeled her tank top over her head, I mean, you can imagine. And if it had happened in the days of iPhones, you wouldn't have to imagine. You'd be looking at an iPhoto. In my mind's eye, I practically am looking at an iPhoto, the smooth golden length of that immaculate body with its demure breasts that I think Ben Affleck was sucking at the time, tattooed, as it were, on my mental retina. Yoga practice, I guess it was supposed back then, would neutralize lecherous gawking. This was years before all the scandals with John Friend and Patabi Joyce and Bikram Chowdhury slapping their dicks against crevices in Uttanasana. Another time I saw Winona Ryder in the Strand, a couple of years after her conviction for felony shoplifting. I didn't stalk her as such, but I was interested to see what titles grabbed the attention of a disgraced starlet. Two titles were The Girl Who Played with Fire and Collapse. She caught me looking and said, "If I just show you my tits, will that make you go away?" That made me feel bad for Winona Ryder. I mean, what happened to her consciousness to make her so crude and unfair? These days, I don't even know who's famous. I go into New York City on a bus that I wish was going out of New York City. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. And what was the name of that triptych again, Tim?
Parentheticals.
Parentheticals. All right. Thank you all for being here again. I'm Ravi Shankar. This is Isolation Break. It's the last ISO break of the season, so we're thrilled that you could make it. We will be archived on YouTube, so you can find us later as well. And we're on to our final writer, and we'll talk a little bit. If you're interested, you can find out more about both the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and the New York Writers Workshop online. And you probably get the sense that it's a really a continual community and really open to anyone. So our final reader of the day actually has a brand new book out. So it's very exciting to have her. Kirun Kapur's latest collection, Women in the Waiting Room, was both a finalist for the National Poetry Series and has just come out with Black Lawrence Press. She was the winner of the Arts and Letters Rumi Prize in Poetry and the Anti-Venom Poetry Award for her first book, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist, which is a wonderful book. She's been named an Asian American Poet to Watch by NBC News, and her work has appeared in Agni, Poetry International, Prairie Schooner, Plowshares, and many other journals. She has taught creative writing at Boston University and Brandeis and been granted fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, the Vermont Studio Center, and the MacDowell Colony. And Kirun currently serves as the poetry editor at the Drum Literary Magazine, and she teaches at the moment at Amherst College. And so it's a great pleasure to have Kirun. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Isolation Break and to all the organizations that made it happen, and to Ravi, who is so often bringing people together in various ways. As Ravi mentioned, I have a new book out called Women in the Waiting Room, and I'm going to read just a few poems from it tonight. And maybe taking my cue from Paul and Varsha, who both read poems that are in response to other works of art. I'll start with one that's about, that's thinking a little bit about the great Hindu epic poem, the Ramayana, which, as most of you will know, is named for Lord Ram, but is as much about his wife, Sita, who in the course of the story is carried away by a demon. I'm looking at myself in the mirror, or rereading Valmiki's Ramayana. Anyone can disappear across the black water. Every girl can be taught her middle name is shame. When will I burn the urge for purity? My bones are a furnace. My face is a game. Every girl steals away with a demon at some point. All her alphabets, ankle bells, all her braids. She will meet herself in the third person. She will lie with her fear. She will dress in her rage. The world is curdled with husbands, blue as the gods, gentle as flame. Let's see. I grew up in Hawaii for the most part, which is, of course, a very beautiful place, but it's also a lot of other things. And this poem thinks a little bit about that. There are a lot of initials in this poem, so you'll hear L and J and M, and that's all. Those are all initials, characters speaking. Girls, girls, girls. Along the strip in Waikiki, past sailor bars and clubs, the length of beach where lipstick sunsets smudged and magazines would shoot and caption paradise. Past posh hotels, where M and I would wait for some nice man to buy us a drink from the bar. We'd watch the women walk like they were stars on stage, dress like they couldn't wait to be undressed, leaning over into idling cars. Out on the west side of the island, Jay tells me any man she dates is more likely to hit her than pay for her dinner. Teenagers holding babies spit at us when we stare. What you looking at? You got nothing. I have nothing, sobs Elle today on the phone. I know it isn't my fault, but when I think of how I let him do it, over and over, even helped him cover it up, I hate myself. I'm thinking of the man who owned the noodle shop, the man who'd always sit with me and chat about Hanoi, warm water in canals, moms on bikes with babies tied down front and back, how to tell a ripe papaya. I saw him on the news a few years back for smuggling women in refrigerated trucks. He owned the bar called Girls, 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 a few doors down from where he served me pho. The one whose sign was made of neon legs that kicked and kicked until they were a stain of light. We liked to swim along the South Shore when the tide was right. You had to time your dive or crack your head against the reef. More than once, a girl washed up. Sometimes they named her on the news. M and I drank kamikazes on the lanai of the new Sheraton. The chief of security coming out to check we were the right sort of girls, regaling us with stories of the wallets stolen off of businessmen by ladies visiting their room, a theft they'd later blame on the hotel maid. I hate Elle's voice, mine. When I think of how many times have I said it? How many times have I said nothing at all, or tried to explain why we aren't at home, the right sort of girl and the wrong, why we're all out under the orange streetlights. And coming back to stories, this is the Annunciation. It will come down to he said, she said, the color of sunlight and shade, what could be heard from the street, whether the spider lilies were still blooming, the great I am spoken by one, swallowed in silence by the other. Many times a day, she will try to think of lying there, his shadow crossed over her, but will conjure nothing. Other times she will wake with the feel of a tongue wet in her ear, though she has sat for hours on the shower floor, scrubbing her face away. Behold, a word of witness. So much went unrecorded between the girl and the angel. Did it pour down like honey? Did it sting? The soul, whatever it is, struggles to articulate. She can still go to that place where nothing grows, where her mind has nothing in it, and only breath ties her to the world like a blue hair ribbon. The movement of the soul towards articulation is slow. No official complaint has been recorded. It is known she was clutching a book, that through the whole ordeal she kept one finger in the page. Behold, a word of holding steady, in the mind, in the eye. Later they will ask why she didn't drop it, use it to push him away. No, it was not the first time she had been in his garden. Yes, she may willingly have claimed to be his. It felt good to be held until she felt nothing. And I'll end with a poem called I Ride Upon a Tiger. I ride upon a tiger. My bones are made of whales, and when whales die, their songs. My eyes are pits of mango, scraped clean by teeth. From my feet plunge 50 streams. The rush, the cold, exposes underworlds of fear. 4 stomachs cannot explain my hungers. I have devoured myself. I tread upon my loves. Strung with a necklace of hummingbirds, my hair in braids, my braids are tongues. Atop my head, a crown of 40 languages, all spoken at once. My breastplates gleam and thrum, 2 armies marching on. You who extract the marrow and the light, you who suck the sun and leave the bone eroded colder. Demon, disease, dear fated one, do you hear? I will come to you on the back of a tiger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kirun. And Kirun's new book, Women in the Waiting Room, is just out with Black Lawrence Press. So thank you all for being here. I'm, again, Ravi Shankar. This has been Isolation Break. If you want to find out more about either organization, please check online. I'm going to bring all the writers back in now, and we can talk a little bit about both their work, and there were so many interesting points of connectivity, I think. And the wonderful thing about the APWT, as you can probably sense, is that there's a community from across the world. And so this year on Isolation Break, we've heard from writers from Hong Kong, the Philippines, Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, really all over the globe. And so personally, as the MC, it's been a really special treat to hear all of these voices, and something I've looked forward to month after month. So thank you all. Big hand, virtual hand for all of our readers today. Thank you. There's so much to talk about. I just thought that was such a rich and provocative reading. And I thought maybe there were a lot of commonalities and common threads, and there was this great discussion of art and race and gender. And I just wrote down a couple of lines. One, there's a line from Tim's story, none were aesthetically pleasing, at least in terms of beauty, which made me think of Kawika's whole discussion about this idea of brown skin. And then a line from Kirun's poem, the movement of the soul towards articulation is slow. And so I'm wondering, maybe we could just begin with this idea, and especially Paul, you mentioned that you have been writing a lot of ekphrastic poetry. Do you mind talking a little bit about how visual art and art in general has been part of your process? And maybe others can kind of jump in.
That was a multi-part question, so I didn't know. You pointed at the end at me. Should I jump in first?
It was. And feel free to respond to any part of it. But I was struck. I mean, even Tim's story had these kind of Hollywood elements, and so I think our response to the larger culture, and especially visual art, film, very interesting as poets. So, why are you working ekphrastically so much, and what kind of has moved you towards that?
Yeah, well, I stumbled into ekphrastic poetry by accident, just because the school that I was teaching at, we began an event at our local art museum, and I helped and participated, and then after several years took over with my friend Anna Cotton, poet, and we would both lead this event. And so it was just kind of a matter of accident of being in that place at that time, and then every year participating. And then we started, both Anna and I together, writing a monthly ekphrastic poem with Rattles, monthly challenge. And we did that. She's still doing it. I had to stop, but I did it for 24 months in a row. And so just that faithful practice transformed my understanding of ekphrastic from like a gimmick, like here's a painting, write a poem, to something. There's something essential about poetry that is reflected in a concentrated way in ekphrasis. And so my line is that all art or all poems are ekphrastic. It's image begets imagination. And I think a lot of the poems we like best have a lot of imagery in it. And ekphrasis just sets the boundaries, right? Work with this image. And then hopefully we take that attention to the world and to what we experience in the scenes of our lives for any kind of poem.
Wonderful. Varsha, you want to add to that? Because I know you also read ekphrastic poem.
Yeah, definitely. You know, my ekphrastic journey really started with at Rice Gallery. We have a group called Words and Art. And in my critique group, one of the painters, she actually conducts that whole reading endeavor. And so every quarter we used to have this huge installation, and then we all write. And surprisingly, there'll be at least 15 or 20 different unique takes. And that's what got me started writing really ekphrastic. And it stopped. Recently we did at Contemporary Arts Museum. It was a very interesting project on sound and how the images look of a number. And we just had a reading this week. But beside the organized ones or the museum pieces that you see, as Paul said, I've collected at least 15 short poems based on the photographs I take. And in this pandemic, this last 6 to 10 months, I have written quite a bit of work, and it has become like a walking meditation. I go for a walk pretty much daily, and I would take a photo sometimes, and on my way back, I'd sit under either a crepe myrtle or oak tree, and whatever I saw and did, I pull out a photo, I write a poem, and I've been collecting that work, and I don't know where it's going to go, but it's really like, words are painting. And paintings do help us write words. So I'm hoping that I would, write more about it. In fact, Tim, you may like to know this, but when I was telling you about Houston in our casual talk, how we have world-class museums and all that. Gaia came from Brooklyn a few years ago. He's an assumed name Gaia. I don't know what's his real name, G-A-I. And he created a huge installation called Marshland at Rice Gallery. And I was going to read that poem today, and I have written a poem called Emily Dickinson Renames My City. Because I was responding to Gaia's comments, like, we have NASA, but we have all these cowboys and cowgirls and taquerias. And I just thought that, and then I took three lines from Emily's poem and saying, to just kind of, she's responding to Gaia. And that's what ekphrasis means to me.
It's great. I mean, a lot of times we tend to think of ekphrasis as this ancient tradition, and people kind of trace it back to the description of Achilles' shield in the Iliad, although, of course, there was earlier Sangam era and older poems that used ekphrastic methods that we don't really learn about. But I agree. I think the ekphrastic poems I most like, Anne Carson has one about nighthawks, and John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror. It's not just a description, but you're formally enacting something that the artist has done, I think. And I have actually a challenge for all of you. I've worked on a series of what I call oresis. So if ekphrasis is a verbal representation of a visual representation, a verbal representation of music or song in some way. So I've been playing around with that. But the rest of you, Kawika, Tim, Kirun, have you ever kind of worked in this register at all? I mean, there certainly are allusions to the wider world of art and film in your work?
Certainly, yes. There are a number of ekphrastic poems in this new book. I think of ekphrasis as not just relating to visual art, but to any form of art. So there's a poem in here about Georgia O'Keeffe's painting, Pelvis with Distance. But mainly there are a lot of poems that talk about other stories, myths, and the retellings of myths. I think one of the things I love best about ekphrasis is that it puts us in conversation with all of history, right? You're immediately in conversation with the person who made that piece of art, and that person was already in conversation with many other people who made art before them. And like translation, you kind of join this long line of makers, I think, in history, which I find to be a wonderful sensation. It's one of the things I love to do with my students for just that reason. They feel at the edge of writing and just at the beginning of being part of any kind of writing life, and both translation and ekphrasis put them right in the center of that tradition and help them join it. So I really love it.
Tim, Kawika, anything to add?
Well, I love this word oresis. I'd never seen that before, and as is so often the case, I find that I'm doing something that has a name. I've been trying to, the story that I read, the stories that I read grew out of an attempt at writing poems that captured the way certain pieces of music made me feel without really referring to them. So, especially the Schoenberg piano pieces. Which are so discordant and miniature, and Satie's Nociens. I tried to write the feeling, and something would happen and it would become an event of some sort or another, but they were very abstract. And I really thought, well, what would happen if I try to do something like that with fiction? Can I do something that is miniature, that doesn't resolve in the way that narrative often does, but create some kind of a mood, some kind of an effect, and then move on. And I found that to be really fun and really useful. So yeah, absolutely. It's definitely part of what I'm up to now.
How about you, Kawika? And maybe, I really am so interested in your work on video games, and I don't know if there's any connection, if I'm kind of forcing it. I'm hoping to get you to talk about that as well, but is there ekphrasis in your own work at all, in your own process?
I think I'm a big fan of ekphrastic poetry, and I used to teach it when I was living in Hong Kong. I found it a really useful teaching tool. But I think in my own work, I'm pulling more from critical theorists who write about art, like Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes and Susan Sontag and folks like that, who are writing about photography and film. And so I use that. I wrote my newest novel simultaneously with the book about video games, and the novel is very game-like and tries to have a game-like form, where it's about a soul reincarnating from life to life, but they fail every single time. So it's like constant death and having to restart, and trying to work out their issues, which are many. And so it has the kind of game-like form to it that, like you said, what I admire about ekphrastic poetry is when it reflects the form, and not just describing the piece. Not that those things are always different. But I wanted to also think about brownness too, as you mentioned. And I talk about Aladdin in the piece, but I again not looking so much at gallery art, but at popular representations of brown people. I find that there's a kind of what's called a trypophobic effect. So trypophobia is the fear of voids, and a lot of things gathered together that look a bit anarchic and a bit almost like a disease. And apparently 16% of the population are trypophobes, trypophobic. And so I found that in a lot of pictures that we see circulating very commonly of brown people, whatever that could mean, migrant caravans, slums, terrorist groups, and so on. They're just kind of bunched together in a trypophobic, and it's very similar to trypophobic media that video games also do very well, right? When you have and films, when you have a lot of zombies and things like that, and that most films, and I don't know if you could say about literature too, tries to take the brown person from the trypophobic mass, into the white home usually. So they're usually orphans, right? The trope of the brown orphan, like Mowgli from Jungle Book. Aladdin is another. The Slumdog Millionaire and all those kind of films, they're about. And then we also have the real life example of like domestic workers, who are brown, circulating throughout the world into white homes, being taken from the mass. And so I'm very interested right now, as you can see, in visual media and visual art and how this can challenge like the way that we think about race and different migrant groups.
It's so fascinating, and I think you make such an important point. I mean, we tend to think of, we're perpetually on this precipice of racial reckoning in some way, and it is not just a political and social issue, though of course it is that. I mean, when you look institutionally at how racism is propagated, but as Kawika mentioned, it's kind of an aesthetic issue, right? I remember my aunts in India used to have this skin whitener called My Fair Lady that they didn't want me to go out and play cricket because I would get too brown, right? And so somehow this ideology seeped very deeply in our consciousness. And maybe we can veer now from this discussion of art to this discussion of race. And I thought Kawika's piece was really powerful and moving and had me thinking about a lot of things. How are you all feeling about this moment around the globe? And I should just mention, I was talking to a friend in Slovenia recently, and apparently she was asking me, is this true? Apparently in Slovenian media, they reported that African Americans and Hispanic Americans had voted for the current president, his name I won't mention, in great numbers, far greater. And she said, that's really true. And of course, one thing is true is there's no monolithic way in which we can talk about this. But of course, it isn't true. I mean, African American women voted against the president in great numbers. And so how are we in kind of in terms of race and kind of moving ourselves forward? I know all of you have kind of worked in and around this subject in a lot of ways. Are you feeling hopeful or pessimistic? Varsha?
Well, I was just going to say I had started writing a poem about Kamla's name. We were working in a workshop, and how do you take a current event, and it's not writing a rebuttal, but it's writing the persona from as if I were Kamla, how would I think the way her name was being made ridiculed, and but so it's on another note on that subject. I feel like with as much as we try to avoid politics when we do poetry, but poetry is political. Most poetry is. So Kamla, I think her being at the number 2 position, things will change. And the brownness, the blackness in between, the shade, all these things, it's going to take a while, but I think it's a good beginning. That's how I would say. I have hope that it is we have just started in that direction. That makes sense. I mean, in response to Kawika's, it was heartbreaking, really, truly. I bow to you for writing that piece. It was beautiful. That, I have tried to write about race and kind of backed off. Like people would say, oh, that's another Indian American, whatever story is. And all of us have worked in different, and I worked in very male-dominated, all-white men industries all my career. So being an Asian woman and one who is terribly tall, I'm so short, i.e. It has always been, when you're not tall, it's even like you multiply color by 4 times if you are that short, So, but anyhow, I'm. This generation has to still suffer as much as they do. It's going to change with Kamla coming up. Yeah, that's my.
Yeah. Others want to add to this? discussion. I mean, I do like to feel hopeful, but then of course, when you look at the course of history, you see these same patterns repeated, right? I mean, I don't think it's any great coincidence that the two great explosions of mass incarceration in the U.S. came out on the heels of the post-Reconstructionist South and the Civil War, and at the end of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s, right? It's kind of a pullback, and so it feels like we make a little progress and then we go backwards, and then it's this geological progression forward. Kirun, any thoughts on any of this?
Well, I agree with that. I think that we make a little step forward, and the optics look significant, but in fact, we take some steps back immediately with that. Those kinds of backlashes, I think we've seen it. I think Trump is some of that in relation to Obama, right? So while I'm delighted to sit, every time I see Kamala Harris's face, I feel joy, but I do feel that that's an optical step forward, which will have, other kinds of repercussions that will bring us backwards. But I guess I do tend to think that over the long, slow arc of things, we do move forward. It's just slower than we'd like, and the visuals don't match the lived experience of that progress, I think, for most brown and Black people. But I do hope that slowly, it changes, and I think it's important to tell those stories. So yeah, I'm grateful to Kawika for that, and I hope, Varsha, you don't listen to people who say that's one more Asian American story. Tell them to shove it. Those stories are so important. They make space for other people to know what they feel and to say what they feel, and for us all to move forward.
I can't wait to read your Women in the Waiting Room. I'm going to read it. Thank you for writing.
And so Tim and Paul, you both are representatives of the cisgendered straight white man here in the minority on this panel, in fact. But I know that you both have done a lot of work around social justice and these issues. I mean, what is your sense about this stuff, Paul?
Well, I'm thinking of Karen's distinction between the optics and the lived experience, and kind of in my whole career in the discipline of English, I've gone back and forth on the value of these stories, and very early on, kind of the writings transformed my life and my imagination and my understanding of race. I remember reading, I think I have it right here, a novel by Ernest Gaines in college, set in the Deep South and set in the contemporary era. And I finished the novel, and I, as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, just kind of wept with the realization that I had been lied to. Right? I had been raised just in American culture being told racism is over. And I had fiction, but it felt real, and it felt genuine, and of course was a kind of proof that wasn't true. And so for many years, I just was a very strong believer in the power of narrative. But like that narrative changed my mind and my heart. But did it change anyone's lived material experiences? Like my mind and heart being changed, did that do anyone else any good? And so then for a while, I kind of flipped, and I said, we really just need to focus on policy and lived experiences, and like good for me if I'm a better person, but that's not enough. Right? Ending racism isn't about making white people better people. But I think where I'm at now is we need all of the above. We need the optics, we need the lived experience, we need policy, we need narrative. As my friend Andre Henry says, it's all hands on deck.
Tim?
Well, I'm thinking about the optics that I've noticed in just the last couple of days. I want to attach to the hope that Kirun and Varsha articulated, but like this morning I saw a post on Facebook from somebody that I knew in high school that was really truly frightening. It was a close-up of an American eagle, and they can look really fierce. And so this is a raptor that looks like it's about to strike prey. And the text across the face of the eagle read, "We are awakened and we are everywhere." And I know that she's a right-wing fanatic with, Second Amendment rights. And if she's not doing threatening posts, around political issues, she's citing the Bible. And of course, everything she finds in the Bible is equally martial and reactionary. And then a couple of days ago in my gym, I overheard a story being told by a young black guy, may have been 18. He was telling some of his friends, because he had a black eye. He had bruises on his face. And he had been jumped outside of a Popeyes right here in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, by 7 white guys who called him the N-word. And then they started pounding him. So I think, and today there are scenes in the news of demonstrations in Georgia, counter demonstrations that don't necessarily foreground race, but that's really what they're about. So I think we're seeing the optics. It's an optics war, so on the one hand, I feel really positive about seeing Kamala Harris up there. I think she's great, and I think she can do some of the things that Varsha was suggesting. But at the same time, I feel like there's enormous pushback simultaneously. And it's scarier this time, in part because it seems so martial, so militaristic.
I agree, and I mean, I think it's there, and this is the more overt kind of manifestation, right? And I think that there's also talking about the racism of well-intentioned liberal progressive people is a much more difficult thing, right? I've just recently been rereading Paulo Freire's The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, when he talks about, I mean, there are ways in which you can be a voice for change and in fact be part of the very system that stymies that change simultaneously, right? And some might say academia does that to a certain extent. Really provocative conversation today that I've been thinking about. And I guess I also just wanted to check in on all of you. I mean, we were, as I mentioned when we got started, many months in when we started Isolation Break, we thought we might go for a couple of months. I mean, little did we realize, I mean, of course, here in the US and most of us here, Kawika, we should find out about how things are going in Canada, because I imagine they might be a little bit better. And what I've read, they're better. But, here we are. There's a second wave of the pandemic. How is everyone doing? How are you holding up? What are you doing for sustenance? What are you doing to rejuvenate your spirit? And Kawika, how are things in Vancouver?
I guess I'll start since I'm being called. Thank you for that. Vancouver has been very low as far as contact and everything, but it's been rising very rapidly, and so we're now getting more lockdown kind of things going on here, similar to the States, but not similar numbers. But I'll respond to. I also wanted to say something about what Varsha said about memoir, because I know, Ravi, your memoir is going to come out soon, is it not? And so I'm very curious about that. And this writing that I presented today is like the first ever that I've tried to write about myself, really. And so I feel like I write about race and everything, whether it's scholarship or fiction or poetry or whatever. And so I think as a Filipino mixed race American, I was really trying for almost all my career until now to see if I could write about race and write good fiction and everything without writing about myself, like without writing memoir or autobiography. And I think only with COVID and like everything that's been happening, it suddenly started to come for whatever reason. Maybe I needed to get a lot out before that could come around. So I think there is a lot of ways of writing about race. But now COVID seems, I don't know if any of you are experiencing similar things where it's pushing you to kind of do things that you wouldn't expect as a writer, to take steps that you might not have, to be braver, or maybe, the opposite. But that's how I'm experiencing it, is, I'm realizing that I live with 2 elders and I have a 3-year-old at home. And so just the, precarity of life just keeps coming back. I'm like, if I'm ever going to do this, I might as well do it, and even if the writing is crap, whatever.
Yeah. Varsha, maybe you could go next, because I don't know if this is your experience, even here, and thankfully there's not too many, but you go out to the supermarket and you'll sometimes see these people, mainly men, I must say, who are strutting around in this kind of macho way without a mask, as if daring you to confront them in some way. And this kind of ridiculous narrative that your civil liberties are somehow being infringed upon if you do something that's good for the collective in some way. I would assume, and again, this is the problem with assumptions, that Texas has its fair share of such cowboys. But how's it going?
Well, I happen to live in an extremely liberal, majority liberal town, near downtown. So there is the stores that I mean, the only places you go to is grocery store. And a couple times I've seen a little skirmish, but I just kind of avoid it. But I mean, I would say 99.9% of the people wear masks at my store. Yeah. Very rarely. In the beginning, I mean, people were not, but now, I mean, we have outside stores. Some stores even have that's booths, where they make sure you have a mask on. They give you to clean your hands, sanitizer. But inside, I haven't experienced that, and I've heard of cases, of people, but even local social media, like we have something called Nextdoor, and there is a lot of self-policing going on by people to those who are being bad boys, bad girls, so which is, to me, I think it's very heartening, but the parts which are real big suburbs, I mean, I've heard stories, and I don't go out there, so can't speak for it.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe it's a part of American individualism in some way, right? But when you look around the world and you see Australia and New Zealand and China, very different methods, obviously, but controlling the virus and this idea of don't mess with me, don't tread on me, and all of that is so seeped into our subconscious. And I'm so interested how these larger socio-historical forces are written on our individual will and decision-making. Kirun, Tim, Paul, any of you have an idea? And I want to hear from you too about how you're holding up in the midst of all of this.
I've been thinking of the old song by The Doors, "People Are Strange." When you're a stranger, faces look ugly when you're alone. It's so unusual now for me to go outside that I feel really vulnerable, and I'm almost happy that I have a mask on because I don't want to appear as fragile as I actually feel. I don't know who's going to confront me. I don't know how I'm going to respond. And even just coming on today, this feels like such a social event. And, you wonder, okay, how do I compose myself to be part of this thing? So I find it unsettling that way, but also very interesting because it feels like I'm peeled raw. And that's such a great way to begin working. So I find it really conducive for writing. On the other hand, just going to get the groceries is problematic, and that's why I send my wife.
Oh.
She knows I'm kidding. She's watching me.
Yeah.
I figured.
And of course, like this online moment has further sheds light on the conversation we've been having about race, right? It further shows the difference between those that can work safely from home and those who can't. I should just mention the Federal Bureau of Prisons, of course, has the highest outbreak of COVID of any government agency. We often don't think of the conditions of these prisons, but not very good at the moment. So just as a PSA. Kirun, how about you?
I'm having sort of the opposite experience. I am not feeling isolated at all, really. I'm teaching, and my students some are on campus, some are off campus, and I think because they're spread out, we don't have our normal sort of in-class community, and so they, I think, are particularly wanting to talk with each other and talk with me. So I would say my interactions with my students are more than usual, actually. And also, I mean, I'm very lucky. I'm locked in a house that's comfortable and has space, and I'm with my most beloved people. So I have nothing to complain about. But it does mean that around every corner there is a beloved face and a beloved conversation. And for me, I can't hear myself. So I'm not really doing any writing. I can't hear well enough to really catch the beginning of something that I might want to work on. So I've been just applying myself to sort of projects, either things that were already started, or I find translation in particular really useful to work on, because that's a place I expect to encounter another voice, and I don't need the same kind of silence apparently for that sort of work. But I know so many people feel very isolated and alone, but I'm in a loud, loving, ferocious space with a lot of people.
Oh, that's great. Paul, I know you're teaching too. I mean, and you're teaching in Florida, so I assume it might be probably a different experience than Kirun's and I teaching in New England. How's it going?
Right, but the school, I think my school is doing a good job, kind of reduced capacity classrooms, a lot of flexibility to do the classes, at least in part remotely. But in terms of like the town that I live in, we're just all pretending there's no pandemic now, and it's frightening. So you just lots and lots of people, no masks, and this is not going to go well.
All right, and I'm just looking at the clock. Wow, time flies when we're having fun. So we're kind of getting close to the end of our session, and I just wanted to let everyone leave you all with a chance to kind of either promote something that you're working on, something new, or something that you're reading that's given you some respite or strength, or a social issue that you want to point us to. Anything at all. Just I like to think of this as the fortune cookie at the end of a really sumptuous feast. So why don't we go around? I want to thank you all again on behalf of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators and New York Writers Workshop. It really has been a fabulous series. There is one more event for APWT, the Meridian launch, which I think is December 5th. It's on the AP Writers website, and we'll have about 10 writers from the book as part of this event, and so I hope some of you will join us there, and the book will be widely available soon thereafter. But yeah, how would you all like to kind of finish this off? And I want to thank you all for contributing your great work in conversation today. So anyone want to jump in? And
I can start.
Yeah, thank you, Kawika.
Well, there's my book I put over there at some point, but there's the book that just came out, All Flowers Bloom, that I mentioned. I just finished 2 really amazing short story collections, which both came out last year. So some of you might have already read them and think they're old news. But I just read them, and they really reinvigorated my own creativity, and just kind of got the gears flowing, for all the bad writing that I'm doing right now. But the first one is Rico Siasoko's The Foley Artist, and it's basically stories about queer Filipinos all around the world, but mostly in either the Philippines or in North America. And then the other one is Home Remedies by Shuen Wang. And that is just like, those stories have been published in strange places for the past decade or so, a lot of her stories. The one that really stood out was one in 2015 called The Days of Being Mild. But it's similar to the other one. It's about diasporic Chinese, but more like younger, kind of millennial Chinese, I suppose. But the stories are just so formally innovative and so fascinating that, as soon as I put together that collection, I was just like, writing is just so free right now. I can do whatever I want. It had that kind of emotional resonance. So The Foley Artist, the first one, and then Home Remedies, the second collection.
And your own book, All Flowers Bloom, Westphalia Press, right?
Yes, yeah, Westphalia Press, and 2020, yeah.
Excellent. All right.
Well, I'll jump in next. I just read and taught this extraordinary book, Letters to a Young Brown Girl, Barbara Jane Reyes. She was able to zoom in and talk with my students about it. It's excellent and formally inventive and personally powerful. I think it's one of those books that has the potential to have a lot of staying power. So I think we'll be hearing about it for years to come.
All right. Thank you. Varsha, Kirun, Tim, one of you want to jump in?
I don't have anything to promote, but I'm working towards just learning a lot of new things, like Ocean Wong's, what's the name of the book on the night ones, on Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous. He's a master poet, such a young poet. His work, he writes so many braided poems, and it's really heartbreaking work. And I'm just trying to understand how one can combine so many different experiences of life in each poem. So that's, I mean, I'm reading some old things, like picked up Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. I mean, I had not read it, and I feel like, and I've ordered a lot of books about African American poets, and just so studying mostly studying in isolation, because, as I said in my poem about that Herman Hesse's, I see people online and one-on-one, but touch is a rare thing. We haven't hugged anybody for 10 months now. So it feels like books are my embraces, it touches my soul as I read them.
I mentioned, I've been inspired by writers who are doing things that I'm not sure I actually like, but I find that they influence me. So I'm thinking in particular of Kate Zambreno, Screen Tests, and I think she would fall into the category of kind of hybrid autofiction, essayistic. You never really know what you're reading when you're reading her. It sounds almost as if it's from her journal, but on some level that it isn't. And even though I wind up feeling a little bit unsettled when I read her, I also find myself writing as soon as I finish reading her. So I find her really useful. She's a wonderful, quirky writer who's starting to get more and more attention. And I just want to mention that next week or the week after, on December 7th, I'll be hosting a reading that will have the writers Edmund White, Sheila Kohler, Robin Hemley, and Lynn Sharon Schwartz. So a really wonderful lineup of some significant writers. I hope everybody can join me. If you check the New York Writers Workshop webpage or the Facebook page, you'll see the announcements. And it'll be the same kind of format with via StreamYard.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Kirun.
I'm mainly just reading and talking about this book for the moment. Writing a book and then talking about it are two different things. I've sort of forgotten that, and so I'm struggling a little to figure out how I want to talk about something that I made now quite a while ago. But in terms of what I'm reading and thinking about, so many things. A young writer who I read with just this week, who was wonderful, Jinjin Shu, is just put out her first chapbook, and it's called "There's Still Singing in the Afterlife," and it's beautiful. And it's poems, but also kind of mixed media. There's Chinese and English, and film stills overlaid with text. I think it's really inventive and moving, both.
Great. Jinjin Shu.
And I'm reading Rosanna Warren's new biography of, speaking of art and ekphrasis, of the painter Max Jakobsen. And she's written poems about him and worked on translations related to him for a long time. And she's written a biography that is deep and really interesting.
And I'll just chime in. I'll add, pertinent to our conversation, a couple of things. There's a great book by David Mura, A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft and Writing, which it kind of had slipped under my radar until I was communicating with David. I just got it. I think it's a really wonderful collection on craft. I've also been reading Mary Ruefle's book on imagination. She kind of starts out by saying, asking me about imagination is like asking a fish to describe the sea. right? And so to begin with this idea of not really knowing the subject that you're going to be discovering, I think is a kind of exciting prospect. And the last thing I'll mention is there's a great issue of the Michigan Quarterly Review that just came out. It was edited by Reginald Dwayne Betts on persecution. There is actually a little excerpt from my memoir, Correctional, coming out next year in that. But there also are a number of other really interesting essays of people who have dealt with incarceration in many countries, including Afghanistan and elsewhere. So I really recommend that as well. I think that brings us to the end of another really vitalizing isolation break. Let's get another big hand for all of our writers who are here today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you.
And it's been wonderful. I hope we'll see some of you at the launch of the Meridian anthology. Will be available in Amazon and small press distribution shortly. If you're interested to find out more, look at the Asia Pacific Writers Workshop website and the New York Writers Workshop. And with that, we'll bid you adieu. Please stay safe, stay well. Hopefully you've been moved to create. I know I'm going to use Kawika's prompt. What I'm about to write is shit, but here it goes in the future. So thank you all so much.
Yeah.
See you next time. Take care, everyone.
Well, bye.